The DNA results came back on a cold April morning in 2019, 16 years after Sarah Chen vanished from a locked house during a blizzard, and Detective Jimmy Sullivan's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone, as Dr. Angela Martinez from the Michigan State Police Laboratory told him they had a match. 13 genetic markers pulled from fabric fibers that had been frozen in an evidence locker since 2003, waiting for technology that didn't exist, when a 23-year-old nursing student disappeared into a February snowstorm, leaving behind nothing but footprints that stopped in the middle of her yard as if she'd been lifted straight up into the sky. And the name on Sullivan's computer screen belonged to someone who'd helped search for Sarah, someone who'd comforted her grieving mother, someone who'd lived in Millbrook for 68 years as the town's most trusted handyman. And when Sullivan drove to the Gratiot County Medical Center that afternoon to arrest Robert Vance, he found the old man sitting in his maintenance supervisor's office, staring at his own reflection in a dark computer monitor. And before Sullivan could even read him his rights, Bob whispered, "I never meant for it to happen the way it did. Sarah was such a sweet girl. She didn't deserve what I did to her." And in that moment, 16 years of impossible questions finally had an answer. But the story of how they got there, how a small Michigan farming community was torn apart by secrets and obsession, and the desperate search for truth in a case that seemed to violate every law of physics and logic, that story begins on Valentine's Day 2003, when the coffee was still warm. And if you want to know how evil can hide in plain sight for 16 years, how a mother's love refused to accept the unacceptable, and how one detective's obsession finally cracked a case that everyone else had given up on, then hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, because what happened to Sarah Chen and what it took to finally bring her killer to justice will keep you watching until the very last word. I promise you that. The coffee was still warm when Sarah Chen disappeared on February 14, 2003, in the farming community of Millbrook, Michigan, population 847. Valentine's Day arrived with a blizzard that would dump 14 inches of snow across Gratiot County, and at 9:47 p.m., Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Elena Vance, had waved goodbye through her kitchen window as the 23-year-old nursing student carried a steaming mug across the narrow strip of yard that separated their modest ranch houses. Sarah was returning the ceramic mug she'd borrowed earlier that evening, the same blue and white checkered pattern that Mrs. Vance had owned for 30 years. And the elderly woman watched Sarah's silhouette disappear into the swirling snow, her red winter coat the last splash of color against the white darkness. And what happened in the next 47 minutes would haunt Millbrook for the next 2 decades. Sarah's boyfriend, Derek Martinez, called the Gratiot County Sheriff's Department at 10:34 p.m., his voice cracking as he reported that Sarah had simply vanished. He'd been waiting for her to return from next door, he explained to Deputy Wallace, becoming increasingly worried as the storm intensified. And when he finally trudged through the knee-deep snow to Mrs. Vance's house, she told him Sarah had left nearly an hour earlier, and Derek had immediately run back to their shared rental house, calling her name, searching every room, every closet, even the basement crawl space where they stored Christmas decorations and old textbooks. But the front door was locked from the inside, the deadbolt. Sarah had insisted they install after a rash of break-ins the previous summer, was engaged. The back door remained secured with the chain lock still in place. Every window was latched tight against the February cold, their aging frames sealed with the plastic sheeting Derek had carefully installed. In November, Sarah's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her keys beside it, her cell phone plugged into its charger in the bedroom. Her nursing school textbooks were spread across the dining room table exactly as she'd left them, yellow highlighters still uncapped beside a half-completed anatomy assignment due the following Monday. And Mrs. Vance provided the only timeline she'd made. Hot chocolate while Sarah borrowed the mug, they'd chatted briefly about the storm, and Sarah had mentioned being excited about Valentine's Day plans with Derek, and the young woman had seemed perfectly normal. maybe a little tired from her clinical rotations at the county hospital, but nothing that suggested fear or distress. And Mrs. Vance estimated their conversation lasted no more than 15 minutes, and Sarah had pulled her red coat tight against the wind and stepped into a night that would swallow her completely. And if you're already hooked by this mystery, then do me a favor right now, pause for 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because this case gets even more impossible, and you're not going to want to miss what happens next. Deputy Wallace, a 22-year veteran of rural policing, had seen plenty of domestic disputes, missing persons reports filed in anger, and young people who disappeared after fights with family. But standing in Sarah's living room at 11:15 p.m., watching Derek pace frantically while snow continued to batter the windows, he felt something different, and the house held an eerie stillness, as if it was holding its breath, and Sarah's presence lingered everywhere. Her coffee mug in the sink, her nursing scrubs draped over a chair, her vanilla-scented candles still burning on the mantel. Yet she was gone. Impossibly gone from a locked house in a town where everyone knew everyone, on a night when the blizzard had driven even the most dedicated bar patrons home hours early, and the deputy began what would become the most frustrating investigation of his career, not knowing that the truth lay buried deeper than the snow outside, waiting 20 years to surface in a revelation that would shatter everything this quiet farming community believed about trust, safety, and the people they thought they knew. Sarah Chen's mother, Linda Chen, received the call at 6 a.m. on February 15th. She was preparing for her early shift at the Ford plant in Lansing, mechanically spooning instant coffee into her travel mug while morning news droned from the small television perched on her kitchen counter. And Derek's voice, raw from hours of crying and calling Sarah's name into the storm, barely managed to form the words that would reshape Linda's world. Her daughter, her only child, the girl who called every Sunday without fail and sent flowers on Mother's Day from whatever clinical rotation site she happened to be working, had vanished from a locked house in the middle of a blizzard. And Linda's first instinct was denial. Sarah was responsible, predictable, the kind of young woman who color-coded her class schedules and never missed an appointment. She'd overcome so much already, growing up as one of the few Asian American children in rural Michigan, losing her father to a factory accident when she was 16, working 2 jobs to pay for nursing school. And Sarah didn't just disappear. Sarah didn't break promises or abandon responsibilities or leave people wondering where she was. But as Linda drove the 87 miles from her apartment in Lansing to Millbrook, slipping and sliding on roads that the county plows hadn't yet cleared, she felt a cold certainty settling in her chest that had nothing to do with the February weather. And by noon, Linda had transformed Sarah's rental house into a command center. She pushed Derek's gaming chair aside and spread maps of Gratiot County across the dining room table, marking potential search areas with red ink. And she called in sick for the first time in 3 years, then called her supervisor back to explain she might need extended leave. And Linda had learned long ago, watching her husband die slowly in a hospital bed while insurance companies argued over coverage, that the system rarely fought for people like them. And if Sarah was going to be found, it would be because someone who loved her refused to stop looking. The investigation's early days revealed the fault lines that would define the next 2 decades, and Detective Raymond Ray Morrison, a 28-year veteran who transferred to Gratiot County for the quieter pace after a career in Detroit homicide, approached Sarah's disappearance with methodical skepticism. And young women didn't vanish from locked houses, he explained to Linda during their first meeting. Young women had fights with boyfriends, made impulsive decisions, sometimes needed space to think, and the locked doors could be explained. Maybe Derek was lying. Maybe Sarah had a key hidden somewhere. Maybe she'd slipped out a window and pulled it shut behind her. And Morrison ordered searches of the immediate area, questioned Derek extensively, and waited for Sarah to call home. And Linda's faith in official channels began cracking during that first week. Morrison seemed more interested in Derek's financial troubles and their occasional arguments than in the physical impossibility of Sarah's disappearance. And when Linda suggested expanding the search area, Morrison reminded her about limited resources and the reality of winter weather. And when she pushed for more aggressive questioning of neighbors, he cited proper procedure and the need for evidence. And when she begged for media attention that might generate leads, Morrison worried about compromising the investigation. And Linda realized she was fighting two battles: finding Sarah and forcing the system to care enough to help. Now, before we go any further, I need you to do something. Hit that like button, because it actually helps more people find Sarah's story. And trust me, you're going to want to keep watching, because what the investigators found in the snow outside Sarah's house defied every logical explanation. The community response split along similar lines. Sarah's nursing school classmates organized weekend search parties, trudging through snowdrifts and abandoned farmland with the desperate energy of youth confronting mortality, and local churches provided meals and prayer circles. But others whispered different theories. Some wondered about Derek's story, noting his gambling problems and the couple's recent financial stress. Others suggested Sarah might have staged her own disappearance, overwhelmed by school pressures and family expectations. And the whispers grew louder when Derek moved back to his parents' house in Grand Rapids after 3 weeks, unable to afford the rent alone, and haunted by the silence that had replaced Sarah's laughter. Linda rented a small apartment in Millbrook, determined to maintain a base of operations even as her savings dwindled. She spent mornings canvassing neighborhoods that detectives had already visited, afternoons photocopying missing person flyers at the library, and evenings calling police departments in neighboring counties. And sleep became elusive. Food became optional, and every phone call carried the potential to either save or destroy what remained of her world. And Linda developed an obsession with details that others dismissed as irrelevant: the exact temperature that night, the precise timeline of Mrs. Vance's testimony, the logistics of Derek's story, the significance of Sarah's abandoned coffee. And as February melted into March and search parties dwindled to a handful of die-hard volunteers, Linda began to understand that she was fighting alone, sustained only by a mother's refusal to accept the unacceptable. Millbrook had the kind of secrets that small towns cultivate, like prize-winning tomatoes, carefully tended, selectively shared, and fiercely protected from outsiders. And when Sarah Chen disappeared, those secrets didn't emerge all at once. Instead, they seeped out gradually, like water through limestone, each revelation adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible case. And the Chen investigation exposed fractures in the community that most residents preferred to ignore. At Rosie's Diner, the morning coffee crowd that had gathered religiously for 15 years suddenly found themselves choosing sides. Earl Patterson, who'd lived in Millbrook since 1967 and knew every family's business going back 3 generations, insisted that Derek Martinez had always seemed shifty. Something about the way he looked at people, Earl claimed, stirring sugar into his coffee with unnecessary force. But Dolores McKnight, who taught Sunday school at First Baptist and had watched Derek help elderly parishioners with their groceries, defended the young man with surprising vehemence, and their debates grew heated enough that Rosie herself had to institute a no Sarah talk during breakfast rush policy by the end of March. The investigation revealed uncomfortable truths about law enforcement resources in rural Michigan. Gratiot County maintained a force of 12 full-time deputies covering 571 square miles of farmland, small towns, and scattered homesteads. And Detective Morrison found himself juggling Sarah's case alongside a methamphetamine lab bust near Alma, a domestic violence situation that required weekly check-ins, and the ongoing investigation of equipment thefts from local farms. And the state police offered assistance, but their involvement meant ceding control of the investigation to Lansing, something Morrison's pride wouldn't allow. And Linda Chen's persistent phone calls and unscheduled visits to the sheriff's department became a source of frustration rather than motivation. Deputies began timing their lunch breaks to avoid her daily 11 a.m. appearances, clutching new theories printed from internet crime forums. Sarah's disappearance also illuminated the complex social dynamics of a community caught between agricultural tradition and suburban encroachment. The original families, the Pattersons, the Vances, the Kowalskis, who'd farmed the same land for 4 generations, viewed newer residents with polite suspicion. And Derek, despite living in Millbrook for 3 years, remained an outsider from Grand Rapids whose family had never worked the land. And Sarah occupied an even more complicated position as a nursing student whose ambitions clearly extended beyond the county line. And some longtime residents whispered that maybe she'd simply decided small-town life wasn't for her, that the locked doors and mysterious circumstances were elaborate staging designed to avoid hurting Derek's feelings. And stay with me here, because what I'm about to tell you about the crime scene photographs is going to blow your mind. The crime scene photographs from February 15, 2003 captured a world transformed by winter's violence. Deputy Wallace had arrived at Sarah Chen's rental house just after sunrise. His department issued camera producing stark black and white images that would be scrutinized for decades. And the blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind an eerily pristine landscape where every footprint, every disturbance, every anomaly stood out against the unmarked snow like evidence written in a language investigators couldn't yet read. And the photographic record began with the house itself, a modest single-story ranch typical of 1970s construction. Its brown aluminum siding and narrow windows giving it the anomalous appearance of temporary housing. And snow had drifted against the north wall, reaching nearly to the windowsills, while the wind had scoured the south side almost clean. Wallace documented every angle, every door, every possible entry point. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, its steel frame intact and deadbolt functioning normally. The back door revealed the same story, secure, undisturbed, the chain lock still engaged, exactly as Derek had found it. And windows remained latched from the inside, their ancient mechanisms stiff with cold and paint, but clearly undamaged. And the most crucial evidence lay in the snow itself, though its significance wouldn't be fully understood for years. And Wallace methodically photographed every set of tracks in the immediate vicinity of the house. Derek's size 11 boots had left deep impressions between his car and the front door, with additional tracks showing his panicked search around the building's perimeter when he realized Sarah was missing. And Mrs. Vance's smaller footprints created a neat path between her kitchen door and the property line where she'd handed Sarah the borrowed mug. But Sarah's tracks told a different story entirely. Her footprints, clearly defined in the fresh snow, showed her journey from Mrs. Vance's house toward her own front door, and the impressions were consistent with her size 7 winter boots, the treads leaving distinctive waffle patterns that Derek immediately recognized. And forensic photography captured each step in precise detail, measuring stride length and depth, documenting the way her right foot turned slightly outward due to an old ankle injury from high school basketball. But approximately 15 feet from her front door, Sarah's tracks simply stopped, not faded, not obscured by wind, but ended completely, as if she'd been lifted straight up into the storm-darkened sky. And I know what you're thinking, how is that even possible? And that's exactly what investigators ask themselves for the next 16 years. So make sure you're subscribed, because the answer to that impossible question is coming, and it's going to change everything you think you know about this case. Crime scene technicians from the state police arrived on February 16th with equipment better suited to urban investigations than rural Michigan winters. They collected snow samples from the area where Sarah's tracks ended, hoping to find some trace evidence that might explain the impossibility of her disappearance. and the samples were carefully preserved and shipped to the state laboratory in Lansing, where technicians would search for hair fibers, fabric fragments, or chemical traces that might provide clues. And the results, delivered 3 weeks later, revealed nothing but frozen precipitation and trace minerals consistent with agricultural runoff. And more sophisticated analysis focused on the snow itself. As a timeline, meteorological records showed that the blizzard had intensified around 9 p.m. on February 14th, with heavy snowfall continuing until approximately 3 a.m. on the 15th. And the accumulation rate meant that any tracks made earlier in the evening would have been partially or completely obscured by morning. Yet Sarah's footprints remained clearly visible, indicating they'd been made during the final hours of the storm. And this timing corroborated Mrs. Vance's testimony about when Sarah had left her house, but it made the mystery of her disappearance even more profound. Inside the rental house, evidence collection revealed the eerie normality of a life interrupted mid-sentence. Sarah's anatomy textbook lay open to a chapter on cardiovascular system disorders, her handwritten notes filling the margins in her characteristic precise script, and a half-eaten bowl of tomato soup sat cooling on the kitchen counter, the spoon still resting against its ceramic rim. And her cell phone showed no unusual activity, no calls, no text messages, no internet searches that might hint at plans or concerns. And the last entry in her daily planner, written in blue ink that hadn't yet dried, simply read, "V-Day dinner with D, excited." And forensic examination of the house's interior produced results that were simultaneously thorough and frustrating. Fingerprint analysis revealed exactly what investigators expected: Sarah's prints throughout the residence, Derek's in common areas and the bedroom they shared, and a few additional prints belonging to landlord maintenance personnel. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry or violent encounter, no indication that anything unusual had occurred inside the house, and the scene suggested that Sarah had simply walked outside and vanished, leaving behind a perfectly preserved tableau of domestic normality. The physical evidence from February 2003 would be cataloged, analyzed, and stored in the Gratiot County Sheriff's Department evidence room, where it would remain largely untouched for nearly 2 decades, waiting for technology and perspective that didn't yet exist to unlock its secrets. And the first break in Sarah Chen's case came 11 days after her disappearance, when a convenience store clerk in Bay City called the tip line to report a young Asian woman matching Sarah's description. And the woman had purchased coffee and gasoline around midnight on February 15th, the clerk explained. And she'd seemed nervous, checking over her shoulder repeatedly while counting out exact change. And Detective Morrison drove the 130 miles to Bay City with Linda Chen riding silently in the passenger seat, both of them afraid to hope too loudly. The surveillance footage from the gas station showed a woman of approximately Sarah's height and build, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, similar to how Sarah typically wore hers. But when the clerk viewed the video alongside Morrison and Linda, his certainty crumbled, and the woman's face remained obscured by the camera angle and poor lighting. Her coat was navy blue rather than red, and her mannerisms didn't match the nervous energy he described. And Linda stared at the grainy footage until her eyes watered, willing it to be her daughter. But deep in her chest, she knew the truth before Morrison spoke it aloud. This wasn't Sarah. This was just another woman living her own life, unaware that her late-night gas purchase had briefly carried the hopes of a desperate mother. And listen, the next part of this investigation is going to test your patience, just like it tested Linda's. Because what happened over the next few months was a series of heartbreaking dead ends. But stick with me, because everything is building toward that moment when the DNA results finally came back. The Bay City lead established a pattern that would repeat dozens of times over the following months. A waitress in Flint reported serving someone who looked like Sarah. A bus driver in Detroit remembered a quiet passenger who'd paid with exact change and avoided eye contact. A hotel clerk in Traverse City insisted he checked in a young woman matching Sarah's description, though the registration records showed a completely different name and the security cameras had been broken for weeks. And each tip required investigation. Each investigation consumed precious resources, and each dead end pushed Sarah's case further toward the growing pile of unsolved files in Morrison's office. And by summer 2003, the investigation had expanded beyond Michigan's borders. Reports trickled in from Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois. Sightings of young Asian women who might be Sarah Chen, living under assumed names, working cash jobs, staying one step ahead of detection. Morrison dutifully followed each lead, driving thousands of miles and conducting hundreds of interviews with people who ultimately had nothing to do with Sarah's disappearance. And the investigation consumed his patrol budget and strained relationships with neighboring law enforcement agencies who grew tired of wild goose chases that yielded nothing but wasted time. And the most promising lead came in August, when a social worker in Chicago contacted the Gratiot County Sheriff's Department about a client who'd enrolled in a homeless services program using identification that appeared fraudulent. And the woman claimed to be from Michigan, had visible nursing skills when helping other clients with medical issues, and seemed terrified whenever anyone asked about her past. And Morrison and Linda made the 6-hour drive to Chicago, only to discover that the woman was actually Elena Vasquez, an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador who'd purchased fake identification to escape an abusive relationship. And Elena's fear wasn't about a mysterious disappearance from a locked house. It was about deportation and returning to a man who'd hospitalized her twice. The psychological toll of false leads began to fracture the investigation team. Morrison, accustomed to cases that resolved within weeks or months, found himself questioning his abilities and his department's resources. He began avoiding Linda Chen's daily phone calls, dreading the hope in her voice when she asked about new developments. And the state police gradually reduced their involvement, reassigning personnel to cases with more promising prospects. And search volunteers dwindled as autumn arrived and then winter returned, marking Sarah's first anniversary of disappearance with no new evidence, no viable suspects, and no answers. And Derek Martinez became the investigation's most persistent dead end. Morrison interviewed him 17 times over the first year, approaching their conversations from different angles, hoping to catch inconsistencies or admissions. And Derek's story never changed. He'd waited for Sarah to return from Mrs. Vance's house, grown worried when she didn't come back, discovered the house was locked and empty, and called police immediately. And polygraph tests proved inconclusive, neither clearing nor implicating him. And his alibi for the 47 minutes of Sarah's disappearance remained what it had always been. He was alone in the house waiting. And in a case built on impossibilities, Derek's loneliness during those crucial minutes became both his strongest defense and his greatest vulnerability. And by February 2004, exactly 1 year after Sarah's disappearance, her case had been quietly reclassified as a cold case, and the active investigation was suspended. Though Morrison assured Linda that any new evidence would receive immediate attention. And the promise felt hollow to everyone involved, including Morrison himself, who knew that cold cases in rural Michigan often stayed cold forever, buried beneath accumulating paperwork and newer emergencies that demanded immediate resources. Now here's where the story takes a turn, because sometimes solving a case requires someone who's willing to lose themselves in it completely. So keep watching, because Detective Jimmy Sullivan is about to enter the picture, and his obsession with Sarah Chen will either solve the case or destroy his career. Detective James Jimmy Sullivan hadn't intended to inherit Sarah Chen's case when he transferred to the Gratiot County Sheriff's Department in September 2005, 2.5 years after Sarah's disappearance. He was looking for the quieter pace that rural policing promised after 15 years with the Michigan State Police. And Sullivan had worked major crime scenes, supervised multi-jurisdictional task forces, and testified in capital murder trials. And at 42, with 2 failed marriages behind him and a drinking problem he'd recently conquered, he wanted cases involving stolen farm equipment and domestic disputes, not mysteries that consumed careers and destroyed personal lives. But Sarah Chen's file drew him back repeatedly during his first weeks on the job. Morrison had left behind meticulously organized evidence boxes, interview transcripts, and photograph albums, all stored in the basement evidence room like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Sullivan told himself he was simply familiarizing himself with the department's major unsolved cases, performing due diligence that any competent detective would undertake. Yet he found himself staying late, reading witness statements by the harsh fluorescent lights, studying crime scene photographs until the details were burned into his memory, like religious iconography. And the impossibility of Sarah's disappearance violated everything Sullivan understood about criminal investigation. People didn't vanish from locked houses without leaving trace evidence. Young women didn't disappear during blizzards without someone seeing or hearing something unusual. Cases didn't remain completely devoid of viable suspects or logical explanations after years of competent police work. And Sullivan had solved murders where the only evidence was a single hair fiber and had tracked down suspects using nothing but witness descriptions of unusual mannerisms. But Sarah Chen's case offered none of the forensic breadcrumbs that usually lead investigators from crime scene to courtroom. Sullivan's obsession began innocently enough. He started by re-interviewing key witnesses, telling himself he was simply updating their statements and checking for details that might have been overlooked. And Mrs. Vance, now in her 70s and increasingly frail, repeated her story exactly as she'd told it dozens of times before. And Derek Martinez, who'd moved back to Grand Rapids and found work as an automotive technician, answered Sullivan's questions with the weary patience of someone who'd long since stopped expecting to be believed. And Linda Chen, who'd exhausted her savings and moved back to Lansing, greeted Sullivan's renewed interest with desperate hope, tempered by years of disappointment. The detective's personal life began to reflect his professional preoccupation. Sullivan's modest rental house in nearby Ithaca became a secondary crime scene, its spare bedroom converted into an unofficial investigation headquarters, and he tacked crime scene photographs to the walls, spread timeline charts across a folding table purchased from a garage sale, and filled filing cabinets with copies of evidence reports that he read and reread until the pages grew soft from handling. And his refrigerator contained more takeout containers than fresh food, and his sleep became fragmented by dreams filled with footprints that ended in unmarked snow. And Sullivan's colleagues began to notice his fixation. Sheriff Patricia Hayes, who'd hired him specifically for his experience with complex cases, initially encouraged his fresh perspective on the Chen investigation. But as months passed and Sullivan's attention to other cases suffered, she grew concerned about his mental health and professional effectiveness. Sullivan missed court dates because he was re-examining evidence. He arrived late for shifts after spending nights driving the rural roads around Millbrook looking for details that previous investigators might have missed. And his reports on routine cases grew perfunctory, while his Sarah Chen files expanded exponentially, and the detective's breakthrough or breakdown, depending on perspective, came during a January 2007 snowstorm that reminded him of the night Sarah disappeared. And Sullivan had been examining the original crime scene photographs for what felt like the 1,000th time when something about the snow patterns finally clicked. And the accumulation around Sarah's rental house wasn't random. It showed subtle signs of disturbance that the 2003 investigators had dismissed as wind effects, and Sullivan spent the next 6 hours measuring angles and calculating wind speeds from Weather Service archives, eventually convincing himself that someone had deliberately altered the snow to obscure evidence. And if you're still watching this, then you understand why this case became an obsession, because every answer just led to more impossible questions. So hit that like button if you're as invested in finding the truth as Detective Sullivan was. When Sullivan presented his theory to Sheriff Hayes, complete with meteorological charts and geometric calculations, she realized that Sarah Chen's case had claimed another victim, and the detective who'd transferred to Gratiot County seeking peace had instead found a mystery that was slowly destroying his objectivity and his career. And Hayes faced an impossible choice: remove Sullivan from the case he'd made his life's work, or watch a competent investigator disappear down the same rabbit hole that had frustrated Morrison and heartbroken Linda Chen. And Sarah's case, it seemed, had the power to consume anyone who stared too deeply into its void, transforming rational professionals into obsessed seekers chasing shadows through endless Michigan winters. And Sullivan's investigation had reached the same dead end that had claimed Morrison, but his refusal to accept defeat would prove to be exactly what Sarah Chen's case needed, though neither he nor anyone else could have predicted the path that obsession would eventually illuminate. Detective Jimmy Sullivan's salvation came in the form of a phone call from the Michigan State Police Laboratory on March 15, 2019, 16 years after Sarah Chen's disappearance, and 12 years after Sullivan's obsession with her case had nearly cost him his career. And Dr. Angela Martinez, a forensic DNA analyst who'd never heard of Millbrook or Gratiot County, was calling about evidence samples that had been sitting in frozen storage since 2003, waiting for technology that hadn't existed when they were first collected. And the samples consisted of fabric fibers recovered from Sarah's red winter coat, which had been found hanging in her bedroom closet the morning after her disappearance. And original testing in 2003 had identified the fibers as cotton blend, likely from another person's clothing. But DNA extraction technology at the time couldn't produce a usable profile from such minimal material, and the fibers had been cataloged, stored, and essentially forgotten until Dr. Martinez's team began working through a backlog of cold case evidence using enhanced extraction techniques that could isolate genetic material from increasingly smaller samples. Sullivan, now 56 years old and serving as the department's senior detective, had weathered the years of frustration better than anyone expected. And Sheriff Hayes had ultimately decided to let him pursue Sarah's case as a secondary assignment, reasoning that his expertise was too valuable to waste and his obsession too deep to cure through reassignment. And Sullivan had solved dozens of other cases during the intervening years, but Sarah Chen remained the investigation that defined his career and haunted his dreams. And when Dr. Martinez called, Sullivan was reviewing financial records from a recent embezzlement case, his mind occupied with mundane details about missing petty cash and altered receipts. The DNA profile recovered from the fabric fibers was partial but significant, 13 genetic markers that would be sufficient to identify a suspect if they had a sample for comparison. And more importantly, the profile was male, which eliminated several theories that investigators had pursued over the years. And Dr. Martinez explained that the enhanced testing had also revealed trace amounts of an unusual soap residue on the fibers, a commercial-grade cleanser typically used in institutional settings like hospitals, schools, or government buildings. And the combination of DNA evidence and chemical analysis provided the first concrete leads in Sarah's case since the initial crime scene investigation. And Sullivan's hands shook as he wrote down Dr. Martinez's findings, his careful notes betraying the excitement he tried to keep from his voice. And after 16 years of dead ends and false leads, science was finally offering answers to questions that had consumed his professional life. The DNA profile would be entered into the combined DNA index system, where it would be compared against millions of samples from convicted criminals, crime scene evidence, and voluntary submissions. But Sullivan knew that CODIS matches were rare in cold cases, and he began planning his own systematic approach to identifying the source of the mysterious DNA. And the detectives' renewed investigation focused on people who'd had access to Sarah during her final weeks, particularly those who worked in institutional settings that would explain the commercial soap residue. And Sarah's nursing rotations had placed her in contact with dozens of hospital staff members, maintenance workers, and security personnel. And her part-time job at a medical supply company had involved interactions with delivery drivers, warehouse employees, and administrative staff. And each contact represented a potential source for the DNA sample, but tracking down individuals from 16 years earlier proved nearly impossible. People had died, moved away, or simply disappeared into lives that left no forwarding addresses. Sullivan's breakthrough came when he decided to expand his search beyond Sarah's known associates to include anyone who'd been questioned during the original investigation, and he spent weeks digitizing old interview files, creating a database of everyone who'd provided statements or been considered as potential witnesses. And the list included neighbors, co-workers, classmates, and dozens of people who'd simply been in the wrong place at the right time to draw police attention. And cross-referencing this list against employment records from institutions using commercial-grade cleansers produced 13 possible matches. And the process of collecting DNA samples from potential suspects required delicate negotiation between constitutional rights and investigative necessity. And Sullivan couldn't simply demand genetic samples from people who hadn't been charged with crimes, but he could request voluntary submissions and collect discarded materials that suspects left in public places. The work was tedious and often felt like an invasion of privacy that yielded no results. 8 of the 13 potential matches provided voluntary DNA samples that were quickly eliminated through laboratory comparison. 3 others proved impossible to locate or contact. And the 13th name on Sullivan's list belonged to someone he'd never considered as a suspect. Someone whose connection to Sarah seemed so peripheral that their DNA sample had been collected almost as an afterthought. And when the laboratory called with the results of that comparison, Dr. Martinez's voice carried an excitement that matched Sullivan's own growing anticipation. And the DNA profile was a perfect match. All 13 genetic markers aligned with the evidence recovered from Sarah's coat. And after 16 years of questions without answers, science had finally identified the person who'd been in physical contact with Sarah Chen during her final hours. And the revelation would shatter everything. Believed about the night she disappeared. But first, Sullivan had to confront the implications of what the DNA evidence actually meant. And you need to hear this next part very carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything you thought you knew about this case. So make sure you're still subscribed, because the identity of Sarah's killer is going to shock you. The name that appeared on Detective Sullivan's computer screen at 2:47 p.m. on April 3, 2019, belonged to someone who'd lived in plain sight for 16 years, someone who'd attended Sarah Chen's memorial service, someone who'd expressed sympathy to Linda Chen and offered assistance during the early days of the investigation, and Robert Bob Vance, Mrs. Elena Vance's 68-year-old nephew, had been questioned briefly in 2003 as part of the routine canvass of Sarah's neighborhood, but his alibi had seemed ironclad and his demeanor had raised no suspicions. And Sullivan stared at the DNA match confirmation until the letters blurred together, his mind struggling to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew about Sarah's case. Bob Vance worked as a maintenance supervisor at the Gratiot County Medical Center, which explained the commercial-grade soap residue found on the fabric fibers. And he lived just 3 miles from Sarah's rental house and had unrestricted access to his aunt's property, including the spare key she kept hidden under her back porch flower pot. And more disturbing still, Bob had been present in Mrs. Vance's kitchen on the evening of February 14, 2003, ostensibly helping his elderly aunt prepare for the blizzard by bringing her groceries and checking her heating system. and the detective's review of the original case files revealed details that had seemed innocuous in 2003, but now carried sinister implications. And Mrs. Vance had mentioned that Bob was always so thoughtful, arriving unannounced to help with household tasks and staying late to ensure she was comfortable during harsh weather. And Bob had volunteered to join early search parties, spending hours trudging through snow-covered fields and abandoned buildings, ostensibly looking for Sarah, while knowing exactly where she wouldn't be found. And he'd even provided comfort to Derek Martinez during those first desperate weeks, sharing coffee and offering the kind of male support that Derek's friends and family struggled to provide. Sullivan's investigation into Bob Vance's background revealed a carefully constructed facade that had fooled everyone, including trained law enforcement personnel. And Bob was known throughout Millbrook as a reliable handyman who helped elderly residents with home repairs, a church usher who never missed Sunday service, and a devoted nephew who'd cared for his aunt since his uncle's death in 1998. And his employment record at the medical center showed exemplary performance over 23 years, with supervisors describing him as dependable, quiet, and respected by staff and patients alike. And Bob's only criminal history consisted of a single speeding ticket from 1995 and a minor citation for burning leaves without a permit in 2001. But deeper investigation revealed disturbing patterns that had been invisible to casual observers. Hospital staff members, when questioned carefully, admitted that Bob had shown unusual interest in young female employees, particularly nursing students who rotated through various departments. And several women recalled conversations where Bob had asked personal questions about their schedules, living arrangements, and transportation habits. And most had dismissed his curiosity as awkward attempts at friendliness from a lonely older man. But in the context of Sarah's disappearance, his behavior took on a more predatory character. And Sullivan discovered that Bob's access to the medical center's facilities extended far beyond normal working hours, and his maintenance position required him to respond to emergency calls, giving him legitimate reasons to be in the building during evenings, weekends, and holidays. And security camera footage from 2003 had been routinely destroyed years earlier. Employment records showed that Bob had worked late shifts during January and February 2003, including the evening of Sarah's disappearance. And hospital policy allowed maintenance staff to use facility vehicles for emergency calls, providing Bob with transportation that wouldn't have been tracked or questioned during a blizzard. The most chilling discovery came when Sullivan examined Bob's relationship with his aunt more closely, and Mrs. Vance, now 86 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, had always portrayed her nephew as her protector and closest family member. But nursing home staff, where she lived since 2017, reported that Mrs. Vance sometimes became agitated when discussing her nephew, muttering about secrets and things Bob made me promise not to tell. And her condition made her an unreliable witness. But Sullivan wondered what truths might be trapped behind her deteriorating memory. And Sullivan spent sleepless nights reconstructing what might have happened on February 14, 2003. And Bob Vance could have been at his aunt's house when Sarah arrived to return the borrowed mug, and he might have offered to walk her home through the blizzard, using his position as Mrs. Vance's trusted nephew to gain Sarah's confidence. And with access to his aunt's spare key, Bob could have followed Sarah into her house, confronted her there, and then staged the scene to make her disappearance appear impossible. And the locked doors and undisturbed snow were not evidence of supernatural intervention, but proof of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a crime scene to confuse investigators. The DNA evidence provided the crucial link between Bob Vance and Sarah Chen, but proving what had happened during those 47 minutes required more than genetic markers, and Sullivan needed to find Sarah's body uncover additional evidence of Bob's involvement and build a case strong enough to convince a prosecutor to file charges 16 years after the fact, and the investigation that had consumed his career was finally approaching its conclusion, but the most difficult work still lay ahead. And Detective Sullivan's surveillance of Robert Vance began on April 8, 2019, 5 days after the DNA match confirmation arrived from the state laboratory, and Sullivan parked his unmarked sedan across the street from Bob's modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street, watching through binoculars as the 68-year-old man maintained the same routine he'd followed for decades. And Bob left for work at the medical center at 6 a.m., returned home at 3:30 p.m., and spent his evenings watching television through windows that never quite closed their curtains completely. And to neighbors and co-workers, Bob appeared unchanged, still the quiet, reliable handyman who'd lived in Millbrook since childhood. But Sullivan noticed details that spoke to a man under enormous psychological pressure. Bob's hands shook when he unlocked his front door each evening, fumbling with keys that he'd handled thousands of times before, and his garbage bins, previously organized with military precision, now overflowed with empty whiskey bottles and takeout containers from restaurants he'd never patronized during Sullivan's earlier surveillance attempts. And most telling were Bob's visits to his aunt's grave at Millbrook Cemetery, a ritual that had increased from weekly to daily since the DNA results arrived. And Sullivan watched through telephoto lenses as Bob knelt beside Mrs. Vance's headstone, his lips moving in conversations that no one else could hear, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to emerge from decades of buried guilt. The detective's confrontation strategy required delicate timing. Direct accusation without sufficient evidence might prompt Bob to destroy remaining proof or flee the jurisdiction, but allowing him to continue his normal routine risked additional psychological deterioration that might render him incapable of providing coherent testimony about Sarah's fate. And Sullivan decided to apply gradually increasing pressure, beginning with seemingly routine follow-up questions about the original investigation and slowly building toward revelation of the DNA evidence. And Sullivan's first formal interview with Bob took place at the medical center on April 15th, ostensibly as part of a cold case review that was examining all evidence and witness statements from 2003. And Bob agreed to the interview with apparent cooperation, settling into his supervisor's office with the same calm demeanor he'd displayed 16 years earlier. But Sullivan noticed immediate signs of stress that hadn't been present. During their previous interactions, Bob's breathing was shallow and rapid. His hands remained clasped tightly in his lap to control their trembling, and his eyes darted repeatedly toward the office door as if calculating escape routes. And when Sullivan mentioned that new forensic techniques had been applied to evidence from Sarah's case, Bob's composure began fragmenting in ways that were almost imperceptible but unmistakable to an experienced interrogator. And his voice, previously steady and cooperative, developed a slight quaver when discussing his activities on February 14, 2003. And his recollection of details, once precise and consistent, became fuzzy and contradictory. And most significantly, Bob volunteered information that hadn't been requested, offering explanations for circumstances that Sullivan hadn't yet questioned. The behavior of a guilty conscience, attempting to stay ahead of inevitable revelation. And if you've made it this far in the story, then you know we're approaching the moment of truth. So do me one more favor, hit that like button one more time. Because what happens next is the confrontation that 16 years of investigation has been building toward. The psychological pressure intensified during Sullivan's second interview 3 days later when the detective revealed that DNA evidence had been recovered from fabric fibers found on Sarah's clothing, and Bob's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face drained of color, his hands began trembling uncontrollably, and he excused himself to use the restroom, where Sullivan could hear him vomiting through the thin walls. And when Bob returned, his carefully constructed facade was cracking visibly, revealing glimpses of the torment he'd carried for 16 years. And Sullivan's breakthrough came during the third interview on April 22nd, when he informed Bob that the DNA profile had produced a match. And the detective didn't immediately identify Bob as that match, instead watching as the 68-year-old man's psychological defenses finally collapsed completely. Bob's breathing became labored, his skin took on a grayish pallor, and his entire body began shaking as if he was experiencing a seizure. But instead of denial or demands for legal representation, Bob whispered words that Sullivan had been waiting 16 years to hear. "I never meant for it to happen the way it did. Sarah was such a sweet girl. She didn't deserve what I did to her." And the confession that followed was fragmented and emotional, punctuated by sobs and long periods of silence, as Bob struggled to articulate actions he'd kept secret for more than half his life. But gradually, piece by piece, the truth about February 14, 2003 began emerging from the psychological wreckage of a man who could no longer carry the weight of his crime. Bob explained through tears and trembling hands that he'd been at his aunt's house that Valentine's Day evening, helping her prepare for the storm, when Sarah arrived to return the borrowed mug, and he'd watched through the kitchen window as Sarah said goodbye to Mrs. Vance, and he told his aunt he needed to check something outside, and he'd followed Sarah into the blizzard, calling out that he'd walk her home to make sure she got there safely. And Sarah had smiled and thanked him the way she always did, because Bob was Mrs. Vance's nephew, and everyone in Millbrook trusted him. And they'd walked together through the deepening snow, Sarah talking about her Valentine's Day plans with Derek, her excitement about finishing nursing school, her dreams of working in pediatrics someday. And Bob's voice broke as he described how those dreams had made him angry somehow, because Sarah was leaving Millbrook, was going to escape this small town and build a life beyond the county line, while he'd been stuck here for 68 years, fixing broken pipes and replacing light bulbs, and nobody ever asked Bob Vance what his dreams were. And he'd used Mrs. Vance's spare key, the one she kept under the flower pot that everyone knew about, because this was Millbrook and people didn't worry about locks. And he'd followed Sarah into her house uninvited, and when she'd turned around, surprised to see him there, he'd grabbed her and she'd fought him. And Bob insisted it was supposed to be different. She was supposed to understand that he was lonely, that he'd been watching her for months, that she was special. But Sarah had screamed and tried to run, and in the struggle she'd fallen and hit her head on the kitchen counter. And Bob said he'd panicked when he realized she wasn't breathing, that the nursing student who'd helped so many people couldn't help herself, and he'd sat there in Sarah's kitchen for what felt like hours, trying to decide what to do. And the blizzard was his salvation, he realized, giving him cover to move her body without being seen. And he'd carried Sarah to his maintenance truck, the same vehicle he'd used countless times to help elderly residents with repairs. And he'd driven to a location he described as a place where the creek runs deep, where the old oak tree stands sentinel, where nobody goes in winter. And he'd buried her there beneath snow that would soon melt and earth that would keep his secret for 16 years. Sullivan asked the question that mattered most. Where exactly did you take her, Bob? And Bob's answer was precise despite his emotional state. The old Harding property off County Road 47, where the creek bends near the collapsed barn, where his uncle used to take him fishing when he was a boy, and nobody's farmed that land in 30 years. And Sullivan made careful notes of every detail, knowing that finding Sarah's remains would be essential to prosecuting Bob Vance, but also knowing that Linda Chen deserved to finally lay her daughter to rest. And then Bob described how he'd returned to Sarah's house and staged the scene, locking the doors from inside before climbing out a basement window and carefully smoothing the snow to hide his exit. And he'd preserved Sarah's footprints because he knew they'd create an impossible mystery that would confuse investigators. And he'd been right for 16 years. the locked house, and the footprints that ended in unmarked snow had been enough to keep suspicion away from the helpful nephew who joined search parties and comforted the grieving and lived his quiet life while Sarah's mother slowly died inside from not knowing. The arrest of Robert Vance on April 24, 2019, shattered Millbrook's carefully maintained equilibrium like a stone thrown through stained glass. And Sheriff Hayes had coordinated with the prosecutor's office to ensure that formal charges would be filed immediately after Bob's confession, but nothing could have prepared the community for the psychological earthquake that followed the revelation that Sarah Chen's killer had been living among them for 16 years, offering comfort to her grieving mother and participating in search parties for a young woman he'd already murdered. Linda Chen received the news at her apartment in Lansing, where she'd been preparing for another day at the factory, where she'd worked since exhausting her savings during the early years of Sarah's disappearance, and Detective Sullivan called her at 6 a.m., his voice heavy with emotions he'd learned to suppress during decades of law enforcement work. And Linda's first reaction was silence so complete that Sullivan initially thought the call had been disconnected. And when she finally spoke, her words came in fragments, questions about evidence and DNA and whether Sarah's body had been recovered, interspersed with sobs that seemed to emerge from someplace deeper than grief, a region of maternal anguish that had been frozen for 16 years and was now thawing with devastating intensity. And I want you to think about Linda Chen for a moment. Think about 16 years of not knowing, of waking up every single day wondering if today would be the day she'd get answers. And if you're a parent or if you love someone deeply, then you understand why this story matters so much. So please hit that subscribe button, because stories like Sarah's need to be told and remembered. Bob's confession had provided crucial details about Sarah's final moments, but his psychological breakdown made it impossible to determine which elements represented accurate memory and which were products of guilt-induced fantasy, and he claimed that he'd followed Sarah from his aunt's house on the pretext of helping her navigate the blizzard, that he'd used Mrs. Vance's spare key to enter Sarah's rental house, and that he'd confronted her with sexual intentions that she'd rejected, and the physical struggle that followed had ended when Sarah struck her head against the kitchen counter, an injury that Bob insisted was accidental, but which proved fatal within minutes. And according to Bob's fragmented account, he'd spent hours in Sarah's house deciding what to do with her body, eventually loading her into his medical center maintenance truck and driving to a location he described only as where she could rest peacefully. His efforts to stage the scene had included locking all doors from inside before exiting through a basement window, then carefully obscuring his own tracks in the snow while preserving Sarah's footprints to create the impression that she'd vanished impossibly. And the deception had required intimate knowledge of crime scene investigation, which Bob had acquired through years of watching forensic television shows and reading true crime books. An irony that wasn't lost on investigators who'd been mystified by the scene's apparent impossibility. The community's reaction to Bob's arrest revealed fault lines that had remained hidden for decades, and people who'd known Bob since childhood struggled to reconcile the helpful handyman with the calculated killer described in police reports. And Mrs. Patterson, whose late husband Earl had always distrusted Bob, told anyone who would listen that she'd sensed something wrong about him for years. But others, particularly elderly residents who'd relied on Bob's assistance with home repairs and maintenance, felt betrayed by their own judgment and questioned whether they'd ever really known anyone in their small town. Derek Martinez, now 39 years old and remarried with 2 children, learned about Bob's arrest through a phone call from his sister who'd seen the news report on television. And Derek's reaction combined relief, vindication, and a profound sadness that had nothing to do with Bob's guilt. And for 16 years, Derek had lived under a cloud of suspicion, knowing that many people believed he was responsible for Sarah's disappearance, despite his consistent denials and cooperation with investigators. And Bob's arrest finally cleared Derek's name, but it couldn't restore the years he'd lost to accusation and doubt, or the relationships that had been damaged by persistent whispers about his possible involvement. The investigation into Sarah's final resting place became Sullivan's most urgent priority, but Bob's mental state made it difficult to extract reliable information about the location where he disposed of her body. And his confession contained references to peaceful water and where the old oak watches over everything, descriptions that could apply to dozens of locations within the rural county. And search teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar began systematic examination of areas that matched Bob's vague descriptions, while Sullivan continued interviewing him in hopes of obtaining more specific details about Sarah's burial site. And on May 3, 2019, 18 days after Bob's arrest, a search team working the old Harding property off County Road 47 made the discovery that would finally bring Sarah Chen home. And beneath the roots of a massive oak tree near where Harding Creek bent sharply eastward, they found human remains wrapped in a blue plastic tarp that had deteriorated over 16 years of exposure to Michigan weather. And preliminary examination suggested the remains were consistent with a young adult female. And dental records would later confirm what everyone already knew in their hearts. This was Sarah Chen, returned at last from a February night that had swallowed her completely. Linda Chen stood at the edge of the excavation site on May 4th, watching as forensic anthropologists carefully documented and removed her daughter's remains. And she'd driven the 87 miles from Lansing with Detective Sullivan, who'd stayed beside her throughout the long hours of waiting. And when the technicians finally carried Sarah out in a black body bag, Linda collapsed to her knees in the muddy earth, and 16 years of held breath finally escaped in a wail that seemed to come from the ground itself. And Sullivan helped her stand and held her as she sobbed, and he thought about all the cases he'd solved over his career, all the families he'd brought closure to, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever cost so much, or meant so much, or hurt so much. The forensic examination of Sarah's remains revealed details that supported Bob's confession, while also contradicting his claim that her death had been accidental, and Sarah had sustained multiple blunt force trauma injuries to her head and torso consistent with a violent assault. And the medical examiner determined that while the head injury might have been survivable, the additional trauma suggested a sustained attack rather than a single accidental fall. And this evidence would prove crucial in the prosecutor's decision to charge Bob Vance with first-degree murder rather than manslaughter. And Bob's story about an accident during a struggle was revealed as one final lie in a life built on deception. The trial of Robert Vance began on September 9, 2019, in the Gratiot County Courthouse, and the prosecution presented DNA evidence, crime scene analysis, Bob's detailed confession, and testimony from forensic experts who'd examined Sarah's remains. And the defense attempted to argue that Bob's confession had been coerced, that his mental state at the time made him susceptible to suggestion, that the DNA evidence only proved contact, not murder. But the jury saw through these arguments with a clarity that 16 years of mystery had made impossible. And on September 27th, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and evidence tampering. Bob Vance showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his face a mask of exhausted resignation. And when the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Bob stood slowly and turned to face Linda Chen, who'd attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where Bob couldn't avoid seeing her. And he said, "I'm sorry." And the words felt inadequate, microscopic against the enormity of what he'd taken from her, but they were all he had. And Linda stared at him without blinking and said, "You stole 16 years of my life. You stole my daughter's future. You stole her dreams and her laughter and every day she would have lived. And sorry doesn't even begin to cover what you owe." And the judge sentenced Bob to life in prison without possibility of parole. And if you've stayed with me through this entire hour-long journey, then you know that justice in Sarah Chen's case came at an enormous cost. 16 years of Linda's life consumed by grief and searching. 16 years of Detective Sullivan's career defined by obsession. 16 years of Derek Martinez living under suspicion. 16 years of a community torn apart by secrets and doubt. But in the end, science and persistence and one mother's refusal to give up finally brought Sarah home. Sarah Chen was laid to rest on October 12, 2019, at Millbrook Cemetery under a maple tree that blazed red and gold with autumn color, and more than 300 people attended the funeral, including nursing school classmates who'd continued searching long after others had given up, neighbors who'd never stopped believing that Sarah deserved to be found, and law enforcement officers from multiple agencies who'd worked the case over 16 years. And Linda Chen stood beside her daughter's casket and spoke about the bright, funny, determined young woman who'd wanted to be a pediatric nurse, who'd called every Sunday, who'd sent flowers on Mother's Day, who'd deserved so much more than 23 years. And Linda said, Sarah never got to fulfill her dreams, but she's finally home, and sometimes that's the only justice possible in this broken world. Detective Jimmy Sullivan retired from the Gratiot County Sheriff's Department 6 months after Bob Vance's conviction, and he'd solved dozens of major cases during his career, but everyone knew that Sarah Chen was the investigation that defined him. And on his last day, Sheriff Hayes presented him with a photograph of Sarah smiling in her nursing scrubs, taken just weeks before she disappeared. And Sullivan put the photograph on his desk at home, where he could see it every day and remember that persistence matters, that justice delayed isn't always justice denied, and that sometimes the impossible mysteries have answers if you're willing to look long enough. Linda Chen established the Sarah Chen Memorial Scholarship Fund to support nursing students from rural Michigan communities who dream of futures beyond their county lines, and every year the fund awards money to young women who remind Linda of her daughter, determined, ambitious, full of hope. And the scholarship recipients never knew Sarah, but they carry her legacy forward. And Linda says that's how Sarah's light keeps shining, even though Bob Vance tried to extinguish it 16 years ago. Bob Vance is serving his life sentence at the Kinross Correctional Facility in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and he's 70 years old now. And prison records indicate he keeps to himself, rarely speaks to other inmates, and spends most of his time in the prison library reading the same true crime books that taught him how to stage Sarah's disappearance. And sometimes, justice looks like a quiet old man spending his final years in a cell, thinking about the night he destroyed so many lives, including his own. And here's what I want you to take away from Sarah Chen's story. Evil doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like, and sometimes it wears the face of the helpful neighbor, the reliable handyman, the trusted nephew who fixes your sink and checks on your heat during blizzards. And Sarah's case reminds us that mysteries can be solved, that cold cases can be cracked, that science and persistence can overcome even the most carefully constructed deceptions. And most importantly, it reminds us that love refuses to accept defeat, that a mother's determination can outlast decades of disappointment, that some people will never stop fighting for truth, no matter how impossible the odds. If you've watched this entire video, then you've spent an hour with Sarah Chen and Linda Chen and Detective Sullivan, and everyone whose lives intersected with this impossible mystery. And I hope you'll remember Sarah not as a victim who vanished from a locked house, but as a young woman who deserved better, who wanted to heal children, who loved Valentine's Day, who called her mother every Sunday, who was stolen from this world by someone she trusted, and who was finally brought home by people who refused to forget her. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and persistence and the power of never giving up, then please hit that like button one final time and subscribe to this channel, because stories like Sarah's need to be told and shared and remembered, And leave a comment below telling me what you think about this case, whether you believe justice was truly served after 16 years, or whether some wounds can never fully heal. And I'll read every single comment because your thoughts matter, and because Sarah's story deserves to be discussed and processed and understood. Thank you for spending this hour with me. Thank you for listening to Sarah's story. Thank you for caring about a young woman who disappeared on Valentine's Day 2003. And thank you for remembering that behind every cold case, there's a family still waiting for answers, still hoping for closure, still believing that someday, somehow, the truth will finally come to light. And in Sarah Chen's case, after 16 impossible years, it finally did.